U.S. President Joe Biden delivered his farewell address to the nation on Wednesday, taking the Oval Office for one last opportunity to frame his legacy and to deliver a warning about the threat from unchecked abuse of power and wealth and what he described as an emerging oligarchy. But speaking from behind the Resolute desk, already President Biden sought to sound an alarm about the dangerous concentration of power in the hands of the very few ultra-wealthy people that he said risks undermining the very fabric of American life.
Our system of separation of powers, checks and balances, it may not be perfect, but it's maintained our democracy for nearly 250 years, longer than any other nation in history that's ever tried such a bold experiment. I have no doubt that America is in a position to continue to succeed. That's why my farewell address tonight, I want to warn the country of some things that give me great concern. This is a dangerous that's a dangerous concentration of power in the hands of a very few ultra-wealthy people. And the dangerous consequences if their abuse of power is left unchecked. Today, an oligarchy is taking shape in America of extreme wealth, power, and influence that literally threatens our entire democracy, our basic rights and freedoms, and a fair shot for everyone to get ahead.
Meanwhile, President Joe Biden capped his half-century political career with a final Oval Office speech, hoping to seal a legacy that has been overshadowed by the Democrats' failure to stop Donald Trump from returning to the White House. In cities across the country, Americans reflected on Biden's legacy.
I think Biden did a phenomenal job, and I'm sorry to see him leave, and I'm really sorry that Kamala is not going to be our next president. I'll be wearing a black armband on Monday.
What was so phenomenal about his presidency? Tell us.
I think that, in terms of Biden,
yeah.
I think that a lot of things. I think that he has all the attitudes that I do about the environment, about but most specifically about our world position. I think that our position in NATO is stronger because of Biden. I'm frightened about what's going to happen in the future. I also think that he was right on target with regard to Ukraine.
And joining us now is Joanna, National Security Law and Foreign Relations expert to talk about more, of course, on the legacy of Mr. Joe Biden. Thank you very much, Joanna, for joining us on The World Today.
Thank you so much for having me.
In your own opinion, how would you describe 4 years of President Joe Biden?
I think first and foremost, we must take into account that Mr. Biden was elected by the American people at one of the most unprecedented times in American history. I mean, look, we were dealing with a global health crisis that crippled our economy, that led to the killing, that led to the death, rather, of millions of Americans here and of course, all around the world. So those were not the ideal times for a new president to come on board. So that means many of the businesses were crippled. But I think in spite of Mr. Biden and VP Harris, I think that they did the best that they could. I mean, obviously they fell short in some areas. But nonetheless, I think that Mr. Biden was able to strengthen the U.S.'s relationship with NATO, adding 2 additional countries, right? And I think that he was able to, of course, manage the global health crisis by providing unprecedented numbers of vaccines to Americans, and ultimately successfully ended the global health crisis. But in spite of some of his records, some of the things that he's been able to accomplish, Mr. Biden is leaving the White House with an approval rate of roughly 39%.
All right, Joanna, I mean, this is a man who has had decades of experience in the American political landscape. But let's begin with the challenges. Are there any issues that tainted President Biden's time in office?
Absolutely. Like I said earlier, the global health crisis coming on as the newly elected president at the time. But Mr. Biden made a number of points during his farewell address. And one of them is that he talked about the role of dark money in the American political system. And I agree with him 100%. And at the center of this dark money argument conversation we're having is a landmark Supreme Court case, Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. What the Supreme Court case did is that it provided corporations and PACs with the ability to spend unlimited amount of dollars in our campaign. So what that means is that those corporations and those PACs ultimately get to determine who becomes the next president of the United States, who becomes the next member of Congress, and ultimately decide what domestic and foreign policies should be priority for America. And it's rather concerning because it has also caused elections to be even more expensive. You're talking about, for example, at the U.S. Congress level, the average incumbent pays roughly 2 million USD to get reelected. That is the incumbent, right? So imagine if it's someone who does not have the name recognition and so on. So it is a problem. It is a threat to American democracy. And I think that if America truly values the notion of an actual democracy, not a perception of democracy, but an actual democracy, it is a Supreme Court case that must be overturned, and it must be the priority of the incoming administration and previous and subsequent administrations to come in the future.
And now it's obvious we cannot take away the fact that his administration also made some notable gains. Like the Gaza ceasefire is the one that stands out at this time as we speak, because it is currently what's going on. But does this have any impact on how his time will go down in history?
I think that the deal coming at this time is good. Obviously, many people in America and across the world would have liked to see that a little bit sooner. And Mr. Trump, after he was elected, he made a commitment to the American people that he was going to work with Netanyahu for a ceasefire deal. So I think that while Mr. Biden would like to take all the credit for this, but I do think that Mr. Trump did play a role, because I think if Mr. Biden could have done this sooner, he would have, because it did impact VP Harris's ability to get elected by the American people. It was one of the issues that was of great concern for many constituents and many young people and many on the far left, right? Which ultimately impacted voter turnout in various states, in particular places like Michigan. So I think that from a political standpoint, if President Biden had the ability to enter into the ceasefire deal earlier, he would have. I mean, I think that Mr. Trump did play a role in this, and I think that they both deserve credit for doing this.
What other achievements can the Biden administration boast of, or maybe President Biden himself boast of?
I think first and foremost, on the foreign policy front, the historic trip to Angola, where Mr. Biden announced more than $600 million of investment that will go towards the expansion of the Libido corridor, which would facilitate the transfer of critical minerals from Zambia, Angola, as well as DRC, right, in a way to revitalize the railroad that currently exists. And of course, that railroad will also help with the facilitation of trade, which is a very important area for the African continent as we see the implementation of the African continental free trade area. So I think that was a great move on the part of the Biden administration. I wish that he had taken a trip to the continent much earlier, but in total, the investment will cost about $2 billion that America, through DFC, will invest in the revitalization of the Libido corridor. But another thing is that he did, I think that's very notable, is he canceled a number of student debt. here in America. And as you know, the student debt crisis is something that is in the hearts and minds of so many Americans. So many people voted for Biden because they wanted the student debt canceled. We wish that he had done a little bit more, but the Supreme Court blocked him on numerous occasions, as well as the U.S. Congress. As you know, during the second half of his term, the Congress was ran by Republicans. And what people fail to realize is that a president is only as strong as the Congress that he has. So if a president has a Congress that does not reflect his party, they will try to block most of his policies. So that's another thing. And the last thing that I would like to mention is the pardons. President Biden, as of today, has pardoned more people than any president in the history of this country. We're talking about folks who went to jail for drugs and so on. And it's significant because we know in America, our sentencing guidelines is often very biased. People of color receive harsher sentences than white people in this country. That is a fact. When you look at the sentencing guidelines for crack versus crack cocaine and so on. So I think it was a bold step. It was a good step in the right direction. And we appreciate that because I think now that many of these folks who are incarcerated can go back to their families and they have been rehabilitated and can contribute to America's economy. And the last thing is the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which created millions of jobs here in this country in various sectors.
All right, Joanna. I mean, from all you know and the experience in 4 years and from what you hear, will America miss Joe Biden?
Well, Joe Biden has been in politics for more than 50 years, right? So he's a face that many Americans are familiar with. And millions and millions of Americans voted for Mr. Biden and also voted for VP Harris as a result of their support for Biden. Of course, some voted for Harris because they wanted to support Harris as well. But he is a figure he is someone who has been in American politics for many decades. So I think that he will be missed to a certain extent. And we wish Mr. Biden well with his family. And we hope that he gets the rest that he deserves. Because we know being the president of the United States, especially during these unprecedented times, have not been easy for him and his family.
All right, thank you very much. I also understand, well, you will be attending the inauguration of President-elect Donald Trump. Wish you the very best to enjoy that historic event. Thank you, Joanna. Joanna LeBlanc, National Security, Law and Foreign Relations expert. Thanks a lot for your time on The World Today. U.S. President Joe Biden prepares to turn the Oval Office over to President-elect Donald Trump. Analysts are already saying that he leaves behind a mixed legacy. Well, our next report highlights some of the accomplishments and the challenges that shaped the Biden administration.
When Americans voted for the next U.S. president on November 5th, 2024, opinion polls showed nearly two-thirds of voters believed the country had been heading in the wrong direction under President Joe Biden.
Rescue plan now signed into law.
Mr. Biden's promise of a return to a more humane immigration regime than under Republican former President Donald Trump soon collided with the reality of a spike in illegal border crossings. He started his presidency by reversing many of Trump's restrictive immigration policies. Months into his presidency, illegal crossings spiked, particularly among unaccompanied children from Central America, overwhelming U.S. border processing centers and fueling Republican criticism.
Early on, they didn't prioritize doing something at the border because they were prioritizing doing other things, getting vaccines out to people, getting resources out to companies and communities that needed resources. But they didn't make a show of doing things at the border. And that allowed the story to be told that they didn't care.
From wars in Ukraine and Gaza to civil bloodshed in Sudan, overseas conflict have dominated Biden's foreign policy agenda. He came to office promising to restore U.S. global leadership in the world and determined to push back on an increasingly aggressive China. However, the U.S. struggled to bring the grinding conflicts to an end and hasn't been able to prevent the deepening ties between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. However, with the war in Gaza, President Biden can be credited with accomplishing the Gaza ceasefire deal in his final days in office.
Ukraine can stop Putin.
Joe Biden may go down in history as overseeing the best economy that everyone hated. Since 2021, as the country emerged from a global pandemic that briefly created historic job losses and brought the economy to a near standstill, employers have added nearly 16.5 million new jobs.
I think it's outrageous, it's dangerous, and it's unacceptable.
In one of the more recent controversies that plagued his administration, Biden pardoned his son Hunter after he repeatedly promised he would allow the U.S. justice system to play out.
I'm extremely proud of my son Hunter. He has overcome an addiction. He's one of the brightest, most decent men I know, and I am satisfied that I'm not going to do anything. I said I'd abide by the jury decision. I will do that, and I will not pardon him.
Joe Biden rose from humble roots in Scranton, Pennsylvania, building a political career rooted in his working-class Catholic upbringing. He announced he was dropping out of the presidential race in 2024, paving the way for Kamala Harris, his vice president.
I believe my record as president, my leadership in the world, my vision for America's future, all merited a second term. But nothing can come in the way of saving our democracy. That includes personal ambition. So I've decided the best way forward is to pass the torch to a new generation.
Biden, one of the long-serving statesmen to occupy the Oval Office, spent 36 years as a U.S. Senator from Delaware and 8 years as Vice President before defeating Donald Trump in the 2020 election to be president for 4 years.
Joe Biden will have a mixed legacy. I think it's too difficult to just tout some of the major reforms that he was able to push through policy-wise, such as the American Rescue Plan or the Inflation Reduction Act. I think a lot of what he'll be remembered for now is his pulling out of the 2024 election rather late in the game that many people believe did not set up his predecessor to win.
However, Biden, a Democrat whose term ends on January 20 when Republican President-elect Donald Trump takes office, signed an unconditional pardon for his son and said he believed his son had been selectively prosecuted and targeted unfairly by the president's political opponents.
To confront the climate crisis and increase our energy.
America's armed forces and participating in today's review. Following is an element from the United States Navy Honor Guard from Navy
And it's a final farewell for President Joe Biden. The outgoing president attended a Commander-in-Chief farewell ceremony in Fort Myer in Virginia. But President Biden told the troops gathered at the event that serving their Commander-in-Chief had been the greatest honor of his life. During the event, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin presented both Biden and First Lady Jill Biden with Distinguished Public Service Medals, the highest award given by the Department of Defense. Mr. Biden hands over power to Republican Donald Trump at noon local time on Monday, January the 20th. Mr. Trump will return to the White House after defeating his rival and the current Vice President Kamala Harris in November 2024 elections.
Serving as your Commander-in-Chief has been the greatest honor of my life. While I'm deeply grateful for your thanks and affection, I'm here to thank you. Thank you for your service to our nation and for allowing me to bear witness to your courage, your commitment, your character. As I listened to the choir sing, I thought about it. You all represent what America is: character, honesty, integrity, commitment.
Well, just ahead of elections in Germany, the country once again has slipped into recession. New data released this week by Germany's Statistics Office showed a contraction of 0.2% last year, pushing economics to the forefront of debates for any next government. Here to talk to us about these challenges is ZW correspondent Mathis Richman, live from Berlin. Thank you very much for joining us, Mathis. I mean, Germany is in a recession for the second year in a row. How did they get there?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things. To get started, Germany has simply become less competitive in key business areas, which is highlighted by the fact that car makers here aren't at the forefront of electric vehicle transformation. China is. Secondly, Germany's getting old, which means really we don't have enough workers to do the work anymore, which has companies here struggling to fill vacancies. And companies here were used to very cheap energy because we had been importing cheap oil and gas from Russia before its full-scale invasion into Ukraine. Those costs surged, as did the cost of living more generally, a mix that is bad for Germany, especially because it used to rely on being able to sell products abroad. Now, there's one last thing business owners here keep telling me. The last government wasn't able to provide much certainty on where it's headed. The three-way coalition here kept bickering about laws, which made it quite hard for businesses to make investment decisions. And that infighting in the end led to the collapse of that government in November, especially because it couldn't find common ground on financing key policy objectives.
Now, elections are set to take place in Germany in about 5 weeks. What are the key challenges any next government will have to fix to put Germany's economy back on track?
Yeah, building on that, overall it's about stability and clarity where the country's headed. But three areas stand out: energy, workers, and infrastructure. Take gas, which powers chemical industries here and heats our homes. By the way, we have about 0 degrees Celsius here in Berlin right now. And but the problem is our gas storage is projected to run critically low going into next year. Any new government will have to find ways to secure supplies, especially since shipments that we still receive out of Russia may be sanctioned as well. Secondly, we're massively short-skilled workers and workers per se. The last government had put together agreements with a couple of countries such as India and Kenya to invite people to come over here for work. But in the upcoming elections, the far-right AfD party is projected to make massive gains. They oppose migration, and some say their anti-immigrant rhetoric makes Germany not very attractive to people who would come here for work. And a new government would have to find ways to bridge those gaps in German society. And third, Germany's infrastructure is really in dire straits. People here tend to say, if I take the train, I will be late anyway. Hundreds of bridges here need refurbishing, and we're quite far behind on digitalization, which includes just, basic access to broadband internet. Fixing these things will cost a lot of money, but the strict constitutional rules here on how much money the government is allowed to spend led to a collapse of the government late last year. So any new government will have to cut deep into Germany's financial fabric to fix infrastructure.
So, Mathis, what's your analysis here? I mean, are political parties now lining up ideas to push into that direction?
You would think so, but it's actually a quite weirdly mixed bag. In their published manifestos, the political parties seem to have outdone each other on tax breaks, which makes sense because of the cost of living crisis gripping people's budgets here. Anybody, would be happy to get some tax breaks. The problem is that the overall proposed tax breaks of each of the parties are so large that any new government would have much less income, which in turn means much less money to invest on those urgent challenges. Two parties have suggested to change those constitutional rules on how much debt the government can take, rules that are some of the strictest in the world.
Thank you very much, Mathis. Thanks a lot for your time on The World today. Let's move to other stories. The U.S. government has imposed sanctions on the head of Sudan's army, and de facto president, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. The U.S. Treasury Department is accusing General Burhan of destabilizing Sudan and undermining the goal of democratic transition. Another charge against the general is of lethal attacks against civilians, including in schools, markets, and hospitals, alleging routine and intentional denial of humanitarian access. Sudan's foreign ministry has dismissed the sanctions as immoral. The sanctions freeze any assets the Sudanese leader has in the U.S. and block U.S. transactions with him. Meanwhile, the outgoing U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is regretting not being able to attend the war in Sudan, to end the war in Sudan, and is now hoping that President-elect Donald Trump's administration will keep trying. Over 1 week ago, the United States determined that members of Sudan's Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, and allied militias committed genocide in Sudan and imposed sanctions on the group's leader. The sanctions have also been placed just this week on the regular Army Chief General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. And something more exciting now. Tourists gathered in central Bangkok to witness an underwater dragon dance performance as Thailand geared up for its annual Lunar New Year celebrations. 4 divers performed the dance at the Sea Life Bangkok Ocean World Aquarium, surrounded by sharks and, of course, other fish, offering a unique spectacle to welcome the year of the snake. One of the divers, 39-year-old Punsak Golin, said the dragon for this year's performance was longer and larger compared to previous years, making it even more exciting this time. According to Thailand's Transport Ministry, 4 million tourists are forecast to visit the Southeastern Asian nation during this year's Lunar New Year holiday, many of which will come from China, where most of its 1.4 billion population celebrate the festival. And that's it on The World Today for this week, the last edition. Thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful weekend. I'm Anne Nwawadu.